I'm Kylie, and I make fresh, delicious Papa Murphy's pizza.
Hi, I'm Zach, and I make the Papa Murphy's pizza.
Sure, that's take and bake. We built it with the freshest ingredients. You bake it fresh in your oven.
By you mean me, so technically, I make the pizza.
Super good pizza, Kylie.
Oh, Kylie, so good.
At Papa Murphy's, we make great pizza, so you can make the pizza great.
Oh yeah, I make the pizza great.
Papa Murphy's, change the way you pizza.
This is a Queen Bee Radio High School sports presentation.
Welcome to the Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien High School Football Roundup on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. I'm your host, Tyler Diktanas. I'm joined by a few of our high school football broadcasters to go over everything that's happened in the first 2 weeks of the season and preview what we have coming up in week 3. Our guests today, Matthew Goninen, Rob Spangler, Wally Trouten, and Steve Prestegard, identifying himself as a Highland and Belmont truther for this week's episode. Thanks, guys, for jumping on. And I know we didn't have a show following week 1, but if we did, based on all the conversations that I've had with each of you guys, individually, the biggest story would have been Darlington shutting out Platteville in one of the most anticipated season opening games that we've had in recent memory. And then the upset win of Southwestern East Dubuque taking down the number 2 ranked and D7 runner-up Blackhawk Warren. Everything else pretty calm and sort of what we expected for the most part. Then week 2 happened. And everything we thought we knew about our area teams kind of got blown up in our face. Prairie du Chien demolished Darlington 35-7. Lancaster gets pummeled by Cuba City 45-14. Platteville, the reigning SWC champions, still have yet to score a point in the 2024 season after being shut out by Mineral Point 16-0. And in 11-player football, there are 23 teams that we are following in the SWC, SWAL, and Six Rivers conferences. There are 4 teams that are 2-0. Potosi, Cassville, and River Ridge kind of predicted them to be where they're at. Southwestern East Dubuque is undefeated. Again, the win over Blackhawk Warren, slightly, a shocker, bit of an upset. But in the SWC, the newcomer, New Glarus, is the only undefeated team in the SWC through the non-conference portion of the schedule. With that in mind, Steve Prestegard, I'm going to start off with you because the one storyline in the high school football season to this point that I think is the most alarming is the Platteville Hillmen. We anticipated them to have a very successful season and to, be very productive, especially in the offensive side of the ball with the players that they have coming back and the success that they had last year. You've seen both games. What's going on in Platteville?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind, and actually I can prove that this is the case when you listen to the Raleigh Cheese pregame show interview Friday night on AM 1590 WPVL, is that Platteville's going to try to slow down and execute better. The funny part about their loss to Mineral Point is they had a huge edge in yardage over Mineral Point. They had more first downs. They had fewer penalties than Mineral Point. They were better considerably on third down conversions. But the closer they got to the Bitech green zone, things started to not go well. You look at what they were able to do from last year. I think they're having some offensive line issues possibly because TJ Pink has not had the time to throw. It doesn't look like he's been comfortable with the pocket necessarily. And Tyler Sass has not had the room to run that he has had previously. But the thing that Bryce Arneson brought up is that they just need to slow down a little bit and communicate better. And he believes that if they are able to do those two things, their execution will be better. I think one thing that applies to Platteville specifically, and maybe everybody else also, is to keep in mind that after a couple of years of computer seeding, it starts to look as though there's hardly any impact at all in non-conference games to a team's seeding, because seeding is based first and foremost on your conference record. If I understand it correctly, if let's just use Platteville as an example, if they were on the table and they go 7-0. They'd have a 7-2 overall record. If they faced somebody like a team that was 8-1, but one of those losses was a conference loss, they would have a higher seed. And I kind of think that maybe has gone into the thinking of a lot of coaches, where they are going out to try to find the most difficult opponent they can to get ready for the conference season, believing that if they take a loss or two non-conference, but that makes them better in the conference season, that's not going to hurt them. So that could be an explanation for a lot of it. It could also be just parity. Platteville, for one thing, has played two quite good teams, I think, in Darlington and Mineral Point, teams with strong lines. And the one question mark coming into the season for Platteville was offensive line. That might be an explanation for it as well. But they're not panicking in Platteville. They're not, going to throw out the offense or anything like that. Can't really do that anyway. But their concern is better execution, and so they're going to try to slow things down a little bit, make sure everybody is on the right page and all of that, as opposed to trying to go as fast as they can, which they were trying to do before, and then things don't quite work right.
Yeah, while you were there against Mineral Point as well, what did you see from the Hillman in week 2?
One of the things that struck me a little bit, as much as anything else, again, comes back to offensive line. I don't think they executed well, and some of it was a case where they were a little overmatched in some positions. Some of the other things as well, they also ran into probably the best linebacker in Southwest Wisconsin. And that's another big part of trying to run the ball on Mineral Point. You end up and you've got Jacob Phillips back there, and he ranked right now to me as one of the best players in the area. And it's not interesting when I say that after only 2 weeks, but some of the things I saw him do, was he blocked? Yes, he was. But for maybe about a half a second, he just gets off block so well. He flows so well. He has great vision. And so you're trying to run the ball with Sass run up the middle. And yes, you can have a nice block at the point of attack. And that's what happened a lot. And all of a sudden there's a tackle for 2 yards. And that's kind of what happened in that situation. That, and part of it also, I think, is the fact that when you were mentioning the idea about throwing the football, and Platteville had problems because he had so much pressure on him, he didn't get comfortable. And a quarterback has to get comfortable if he's going to throw the ball. You have to have some comfort. And he didn't have that. Part of that, again, is some of the breakdown up front. And that, again, is where I think Coach Arneson is spot on. It's the idea you have to slow yourself back down a little bit and take a look more specifically at what you're doing. And you take a look at your game film, and that's where you base some things on. How good is Mineral Point? I think they're very good. And I think the SWAL is going to be a very, very interesting league this year. And I say that because we turn around and I'm jumping to another area you probably are not ready to go in, but I take a look at what happened to Cuba City the first week of the year, and then Cuba City the second week. I mean, it turns around and Potosi Castle hands it to them, basically. And then we come back the next week and Cuba City hands it to Lancaster. This parity stuff, you betcha, it's starting to show.
What a difference a week makes for Cuba City between weeks 1 and 2, and how much that defense very much improved. And we'll stick with the SWAL for just a bit. As you know, we were talking about Mineral Point. Matthew, you and I got to see the first game that the Pointers played against Lancaster, and then you got to see Mineral Point play Platteville in week 2. We were discussing just before we started recording about how much Mineral Point might have improved between weeks 1 and 2. It felt like, especially in week 1, with those 13 penalties, that really just disrupted any sort of momentum that Mineral Point wanted to have, especially in the ground game, where there were multiple big runs that Mineral Point had on Lancaster that got called back for, a holding penalty, or there were multiple pre-snap penalties on first downs, after change of possession that really changed things. And it kind of felt like that Mineral Point got those cleaned up a bit, but there's still some things that Mineral Point probably wants to get tightened up before that big matchup with Darlington coming up on Friday.
Yeah, and when you talk about Mineral Point, you really see a lot of the interesting things that we mentioned with high school football coming to light. One of those things is how all your personnel changes out year to year. Last year, Mineral Point had the #1 leading passer in the SWAL, and this year they've thrown very few passes so far. They're leaning on that run game and that offensive line. And then with that, you see some of the growing pains, which is part of the reason that for Mineral Point and other teams, I'm sure, you see such a big jump or questions going from week 1 to week 2. So as we get into SWAL play, you mentioned Mineral Point and Darlington playing week 3. It's going to be really interesting. A lot of the teams in the SWAL have made it a point to schedule some really challenging opponents. So Mineral Point, Cuba City, Darlington, even teams like Southwestern East Dubuque, who's coming over to the SWAL this year, they've had some tests early in the season. So it's going to be interesting to see. And for Mineral Point, the question is not necessarily this week facing Darlington. I think going forward into the season is what does the pass defense look like? But if we're talking this week against Darlington, wanting to open up SWAL play on a good foot, the question is going to be who's going to be stronger in the run game and the run defense. Both teams like to run the ball, and both teams credit themselves for having a strong run game, strong O-line, strong D-line. Question is, who can do it better? The last 2 times it's been Darlington in a close one, and we'll see how it goes week 3.
I'm very curious to see how that matchup in week 3 goes, just because of what happened to Darlington last week against Prairie du Chien. You had a very strong showing against Platteville, a team that we, expect to be one of the better teams in the area just based on how they played last year and, who they bring back, as we were, mentioning before. But I don't know if this is exactly the greatest week to be Mineral Point with Darlington trying to get things, back on the right foot. The other part to that, though, is, I don't think any of us saw what happened in that game against Prairie du Chien. We don't know if there were, any, injuries or things of that sort that kind of factored into it. We know that Darlington isn't necessarily the deepest team, especially, in the conference compared to, say, Cuba City, who has, 1 million players on their sideline. But I'm very curious to see, not just this week for Mineral Point, but the following week where they play at Cuba City. And, the next 2 weeks for Mineral Point, they have a real opportunity to have a say in how this SWAL, season plays out, and they can really set the pace for the other teams to follow, Matthew.
Yeah, it's going to be kind of make or break the next couple of weeks, and I've had the opportunity to talk to Coach Leonard after their past couple of games, and you mentioned the penalties. That was really the killer for them in the game against Lancaster. They had so many rushing yards that they ended up losing out on in that game, and now the question is, can they look to some of the play action passes or some of that other stuff to change up their offense besides just the run game, as teams are starting to recognize what their identity might be? But it's going to be exciting with some of these big matchups in the SWAL early in the season. That's really going to pave the way for what the rest of the conference season is going to look like.
One of the things looking back and kind of looking at Mineral Point as an offensive team, yes, they run the ball well, but when do they run the ball well? When Reed Ackerman's at quarterback. That's when they run the ball well. When all of a sudden, if you want to pass the ball, he's not a strong passer. He really isn't. So if you're going to be switching back and forth, that's a weakness that they have as far as trying to defend him. Because a good defensive coordinator from another team can say, well, if #1 is back there, with Corey, now we got a little problem here. We can expect that ball's probably going to go in the air more likely than not. But if Ackerman's back there, they're running that ball every bit that they possibly can. Because not only is Ackerman dangerous running the football, he's sitting back there with a pretty doggone good running back with him in Rowan Carey. He's a pretty good ball player too. So I see where their strength is running the ball, definitely. They can pass, but that's not quite that's their problem, trying to get that together.
And for me, that's the biggest question for Mineral Point going into the next week is how much of their playbook are they going to be able to use Tyler? I was at the Lancaster game with you, and then what I noticed from week 1 to week 2 is they had more success with more types of runs, less halfback dives up the middle. Reed Ackerman looked more comfortable in running some of those option runs, some triple options, some design quarterback keeper, and even switching out running backs. So the question is, can they incorporate some pass game, and can they keep him comfortable in the run game? Because if neither of those things can be true, there's not that many plays that they're going to be able to run, even though that is a strong suit for them. So how successful they're going to be with some of those things, that's going to be the key against Darlington on offense for the Pointers.
And I think you're exactly right. If they can work themselves with Ackerman actually becoming, he's not a great downfield passer. He could dump the ball off. And that's where you're coming into that type of thing where he's faking like he's going to run the ball and then he dumps it off. That could become very dangerous. And who knows? That's where Coach Leonard may be taking it. Hey, he's a good coach. He knows how to do that stuff.
It's funny you bring that up, Matthew, too, because, from what I remember in that first game, Mineral Point's success was bouncing the ball outside with Rowan Carey and Ackerman. And that's where a lot of their success was. When they tried to run, between the tackles, there was no room to run. And it felt like that Mineral Point was maybe just trying to force it a little too much and, kind of thinking that, we have this experienced offensive line. We have everyone back from last year that we can just, push everyone back and do it at will. And it just didn't work for them in that first game. So I think, to your point, if they can diversify how they run the football and, be creative as far as how they can get their, backs to move the ball, I think that's going to really help Mineral Point be successful. And I think that they have a really awesome test for that coming up on Friday night. That should be a really fun matchup between Mineral Point and Darlington. Let's move on to one of the other teams in the SWAL, Cuba City. What an outstanding performance they had against Lancaster last week. 45-14 was the final in that one. I got to call that one with Gary Craw on Super Hits 106 on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. The stats tell the story. Cuba City rushing the football in the game, 48 attempts, 352 yards, and 5 touchdowns. And Lancaster running the ball in the game against Mineral Point, they had 66 combined rushing yards. In this game, they had 76. That is not Lancaster type numbers as far as running the football. The passing attack did not work well at all. Nolan Wolf threw 3 interceptions in the game, two interceptions on the first 2 possessions that led to 10 Cuba City points that really set the tone there. And Rob and Wally, both of you were there for the first game where they played at Potosi Cassville, which I thought was a really good test for both teams to kind of see, where they're at and how things can shake out and set the tone for the season. But boy, did Cuba City really ratchet things up, especially on the defensive side of the ball from week 1 to week 2. Rob, you've been calling Cuban games for most of the last 3 years here and have seen the growth of this Cuba City team. And boy, is this a signature win for the players and for Coach Kopp for the Cuban side.
Yeah, I will admit, almost a shocking outcome. To handle Lancaster the way they did was jaw-dropping. And I wasn't there, but I was in Pittsburgh listening to the action actually on our station Queen Bee Radio apps. And
nice plug.
yeah. And I tell you what, it was. I about drove off. I was literally driving in the Pittsburgh area, and I just about drove off the road when I heard the scoring update.
Don't do that.
And I was like, "What? They're doing what to Lancaster?" That was. I mean, it raises a few questions. Number one, going into week 1, I think a lot of us assume Darlington maybe. At least I assumed maybe the best team in Southwest Wisconsin again, which isn't a crazy assumption. And they dominated. And then after week 2, you see Darlington get manhandled by Prairie, and then Cuba City bounces back and manhandles Lancaster. And as I said to you earlier this week, Tyler, I know nothing Whatever I thought, any assumptions I had going into the season, week 1 to week 2, they just kind of got flipped upside down. But getting back to Cuba City, I mean, wow, what an impressive performance. What a dominating performance. And you got to think that bodes well for them the rest of the season, because I'll be honest, I kind of looked at it like they are staring down the barrel of 0-2, much like I kind of thought Mineral Point was staring down the barrel of 0-2. And both teams, again, strong bounce back wins. Platteville is the 0-2 team. And again, I did not see that one coming, So it's been 2 weeks in, it's been a bit of a wild and crazy ride, and we're just getting started. But Cuba City, yeah, if you're Cuba, I think you feel really good about that performance against Lancaster. And if you can keep that momentum going, the schedule is not necessarily going to get easier, but you've got that positive momentum. And now the question is, were we sleeping? I mean, not sleeping, but is Potosi Cassville the best team in Southwest Wisconsin? I mean, maybe. We'll see. We'll see how this plays out. But it's been a fun 2 weeks, even though I didn't call any action last week.
Well, to your point, Potosi Cassville is now
number
number 1 in D7 in the latest WisSports.net coaches poll. So there is, there's expectation that, this team can be very good. And I was curious about them heading into the season because, when you lose, Roman Frederick, Eli Adams, and Braden Fishnick, your 3 best rushers and really the catalyst of that team. Somehow Potosi Cassville finds a way to get 50-plus players on their team, and they just replace him with Isaiah Groom and Joe Haas and Dawson Weber at quarterback. And it just feels like that there was no drop-off for Potosi Cassville. And what was really interesting to me, Rob, was, in talking with Guy Kopp for the pregame interview that I did with him, he was very optimistic about his team. He's like, yeah, we moved the football on a very stingy Potosi Cassville defense. We just got in our own way, and we cleaned that up. And obviously they did with the way that they played. I mean, like I said, the stats, tell the story there. Wally, the point you were trying to make. Go ahead.
Well, and I look at it as the idea that you're taking a look at Potosi Cassville or Cuba City against Potosi Cassville, and I think they did a heck of a job putting on the points that they put on the board. I was a little surprised at the fact that they were able to put 45 points on Lancaster. That surprised me a little bit because of how Potosi Cassville. I look at the fact they shut them down. I mean, that's not a fair thing to say, but again, remember that Cuba City scored at the end of the Potosi Cassville game with 5 minutes to go to make it a little tighter to get to that 21 points. But rushing the football, it's almost like Cuba City wasn't even there against Potosi Cassville. They only rushed for roughly 50 yards, and that had to have been more against Lancaster. They had to have done better. But Tyson Richard could put the ball in the air. And he's got receivers, and that's what had to have happened at Lancaster. That had to have been throwing the football, in my opinion. I haven't seen the stats from it, so I'm making an assumption. Because he ended up and he threw for 245 yards against Potosi Cassville. And that's where everything was. He was 23 or 18 of 23 in that game.
I have the stats right here. Tyson Richard, 6 of 10 for 153 yards, no touchdowns, no interceptions. And the leading receiver, Gavin Vossen, 3 catches for 91 yards. And he did have the 1 receiving touchdown. We'll have to talk with Guy Kopp about getting Tyson Richard's stats corrected. But yes, Gavin Vossen did have a receiving touchdown. I do remember distinctly calling that one. So yes, there was 1 touchdown pass there. But yeah, it was really the running game where, again, Andy Leffelholtz, individually 17 carries, 158 yards, and 3 rushing touchdowns, all of them coming in the first half. And, the way that the game script went, I believe it was the 3rd play from scrimmage where the first interception happened. It was a interception thrown from Wolf to Gavin Vossen on the near sideline, brought it out to the 30-yard line. The very next play, Leffelholtz takes off on a, delayed handoff and sprints down the sideline, and it's 7-0, Cuba City from there. And one other thing about Cuba City I want to mention, we got to keep our eye on this. They've got a kicker, Landon Bush.
Oh, yeah.
He was 6 for 6 on extra points and had a 32-yard field goal in the game that against Lancaster. So that changes the dynamic a little bit, I think, as far as how defenses have to play Cuba City, because they've got a kid on that sideline that's got a leg that's very accurate. He was not off target on any of those kicks at all. They were, end over end kicks right down the middle. And that's something that I think is going to make things a little bit interesting for teams, how they play, Cuba City down the line.
Yeah, if you want to talk about.
I was just going to say, going back to that Cuba City Potosi game, the big thing of Potosi, and we'll talk more about them later, it isn't the individual runners like they had a year ago. It's their offensive line. Those kids play well together, and they have been together for a little bit. So that's where Potosi Casville's tough.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely the case with Potosi Casville. And we have to remember that Lancaster last year had these bulldozers as offensive linemen last year, unlike anybody they faced basically up until they came to Darlington in the postseason. Well, those guys graduated and they played well enough, obviously, to beat Mineral Point in the first week, but obviously they must have gotten overwhelmed by Cuba City than last week. Mineral Point's got a very good offensive line. Darlington has a very good offensive line. So, maybe the explanation for the weird stuff that we've seen, particularly last week, is simply good or not good, line play. That may be it.
Yeah.
Okay, Matthew, I promise. You're up. Let's go, Matthew.
Kind of back to what you were talking about with the kickers, Tyler. If you want to see the skill gap from higher division high school, college to lower division high school, kicker's one of those spots you're going to see at. So that's going to be a really big thing for Cuba City, the ability to kick field goals. And the 2 games that I've called, I think I've seen more turnovers on downs than I've seen the rest of my life combined. So the ability to have a kicker, it opens up the options so much in terms of scoring. And then one thing that we all talked about in the SWAL preview earlier this year with Cuba City is the depth and the amount of seniors that they have. And especially with the run game, keeping guys fresh and having the chemistry on the offensive line, that's going to go a long way. And for a running back like Andy Leffelholtz, that's something that you've got to really appreciate every week.
Yeah, I got one more thought on Cuba City. Speaking of that, because I remember speaking with Guy Kopp week 1 about the offensive line, about their offensive line in particular. That was, a point of pride for him as a coach. He felt like that unit was going to be very strong this year. And again, after week 1, the thought is, maybe that O-line isn't as good. Maybe Potosi Casville's D-line is really good. And so I think that's probably the big takeaway is Potosi Casville. Again, you said they're rated number 1, Tyler, in D7, right?
Yes.
I mean, I think that's warranted. I think Potosi Casville, and again, long season to go, but right now, they might, lay claim, put the flag in the ground as maybe the best team in Southwest Wisconsin. But we'll see. We'll see how it plays out. But again, getting back to Cuba City, I do think they have a really good offensive line, and obviously it showed against Lancaster with 350 plus yards rushing. That means they kind of manhandled the Arrows. So.
Yep, and the interesting test that Cuba City has coming up this Friday night on Super Hits 106, they go to Belleville. Belleville is 0-2, but when you look at the scores, Belleville lost to Wyowega Fremont 28-27, and then lost to New Glarus 16-13. So they've been close losses. They've been in competitive games. You just kind of feel like Belleville they've got a chip on their shoulder to, really show up and play, on their home field. I am curious to see if Cuba City can maintain that success over the course of the season. I think that, even as the season goes along, the game against Lancaster, that's a game that Guy Kopp is going to be able to point to and say, we know how good we are capable of playing. And if we play like this, we are going to be a tough team, be a tough out any week. So I think, being able to, stay that successful, do the things that went right, leading up to that Lancaster game, and obviously the execution that they had in all three phases of the game. I think that that's going to be a key part for Cuba City and keeping that momentum. So the SWAL game's coming up on Friday night. Again, Cuba City at Belleville on Super Hits 106. Darlington at Mineral Point. Matthew will have that one on MPTV. The two other games, we also have Stockton at Benton Scales Mount Charlesburg. Steve and I will have the call of that one on Saturday on Extreme 107.1, 11 o'clock kickoff. Have breakfast with us on Saturday morning. The other game, Fenimore at Southwestern East Dubuque. And all this talk about the SWAL, the mainstays, the Darlingtons, the Mineral Points, the Cuba Cities. Southwestern East Dubuque is not a team that should be overlooked in the SWAL this year. You look at what they did to Blackhawk Warren in week 1, a 28-20 win on a last-minute touchdown pass. I have the stats here. A 53-yard touchdown pass from Aiden Collins to Brody Culbertson with 10 seconds to go gave Southwestern East Dubuque the win there. And then, of course, Southwestern East Dubuque beat Boscobel very handily, and that scored just a second ago. But yeah, just know that Southwestern East Dubuque took care of Boscobel. And Southwestern East Dubuque, since that co-op has started, they've been on an upward trend. They were giving the Six Rivers teams, some fits. And I think, like we talked on the preview show, having Southwestern back in the SWAL for football, just as familiarity with all the other SWAL teams in the area, I think that actually plays in their favor a little bit, just having that familiarity and, who the good athletes are in the area. But yeah, Southwestern East Dubuque is a very dangerous team. And we talked about Mineral Point having a say in how the conference is going to shake out over the next 2 weeks. The way Southwestern East Dubuque plays against each of those teams, I think, really makes things interesting. So we'll keep an eye on Southwestern East Dubuque. They host Fenimore, who, again, kind of had an up and down season so far. They took care of Iowa Grant easily, 42-0, a game that you saw, Steve, in the opening week. And then Fenimore lost to River Ridge 38-8. So very up and down as far as the end results there. So that's the breakdown of the SWAL. Let's go back to the SWC for just a minute, because we've been kind of hinting at the Lancaster Flying Arrows and how they played against some of the teams through weeks 1 and 2. They got the 21-6 win over Mineral Point, and then of course that big loss to Cuba City, 45-14. The thing that stands out the most to me, outside of Lancaster not rushing the ball very well, that rush defense is not very good right now. Obviously, as I said, giving up 350 yards to Cuba City, that really set the tone for that big victory for the Cubans in week 2. And in week 1, Matthew and I were talking about this a little bit ago too, about how Mineral Point was able to run the ball very well against Lancaster. They had over 200 yards rushing there, but it was Mineral Point's own mistakes that really negated that. And for a team that's really relying on speedy wide receivers and speedy running backs, having less than 75 yards per game to this point is just really alarming. And then not really having a ton of success passing the football outside of the first quarter and a half of the season, where Brendan Gildersleeve was the top receiver for the Arrows. Brendan Gildersleeve gets hurt in the second quarter of that game, and then all of a sudden the Lancaster offense goes completely stagnant. Wally, I'm a big believer in complementary football, where if the offense has success, sometimes your offense can be your best defense, where if you keep the offense on the field, that helps your defense out. It's hard for me to believe that one specific player going out completely disrupts everything. But this early in the season, is it a matter of is the playbook just not big enough? Is there anything that we can really point to as far as why the running game would be so absent for a team that's been running it so successful over the last couple of years, coupled with the fact that the rush defense on the other side of the ball isn't doing them any favors either?
if you look at Lancaster, who has been running the ball the last few years, that'll answer part of your question. They had top shelf running backs. I mean, you were looking at guys that could just pick them up and put them down. They were fast, they were strong, they were everything. I'm not so certain you're seeing much of that in that backfield, quite like that. The skill level isn't quite like it was, and that's part of it. As far as having somebody go down and having so much all of a sudden fall apart, early in the season, a lot of that becomes a mental thing on other players. Where you look and you say, this guy is going to be able to do this for us all year, and all of a sudden he's gone. For high school kids, that can take some wind out of your sails. And that can slow you back down a little bit. And I don't know anything about his injury. I pray that for him and their team that he'll be back here fairly soon. But if he's back, then you're going to see a resurgence. I'm sure of that. But without him, I think they're going to struggle rushing the football for a while.
And I will say, Jordan Rowland, did say in the pregame interviews that I did with him that, they're not going to hide behind the fact that, the offense is going to run through quarterback Nolan Wolf. And, when Brendan Gildersleeve was on the field, 3 rushing touchdowns. Matthew, you can attest to this too. When he was on the field, Lancaster was moving the ball and they were moving it at will on Mineral Point. So as soon as he leaves, it's just really strange that all of a sudden everything, kind of falls apart. And, I know that not all teams in the area are necessarily the deepest. Teams in general, struggle with numbers, but Lancaster's not necessarily one of those teams. But is it also one of those things where if one player goes down, you have to completely reshuffle things and, people are playing different positions that they weren't expecting to play, in that game? And, how much time do coaches necessarily have to, prepare other players to fill in positions that they aren't necessarily, playing on day one? It's just kind of a weird dynamic. Matthew, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think Lancaster for me is probably the most interesting team in the area in terms of what they're going to look like for the rest of the season. And I think at least the good thing for the Lancaster coaching staff, in my opinion, is they know what they're working with their team. When we talked to them before the Lancaster Mineral Point game, they know they've got a lot of those skill positions back, a lot of really talented athletes. But for me, my biggest concern with them is the offensive line. We know Samaje Vincent at running back, really good track athlete, very fast, very strong runner. But as a team, Lancaster's averaging 3.5 yards per rush attempt. So if they can clean up some of those blocks on the offensive line, then besides the run game, that might affect the passing game. And you talk about Gildersleeve going down. If my memory serves me correct, he scored the first 2 touchdowns on receptions against Mineral Point. So that also possibly part of the issue, but they do have other talented skill positions as well. So while I think that might be part of it, I think a lot of it could just be attributed to the lack of experience up front and just seeing that trickle down through the rest of the offense.
And I think it's going to be a very,
in the
very
backfield as well.
And I think it's going to be an interesting test Friday night for both teams, Lancaster and New Glarus. Yeah, New Glarus is 2-0, but the teams they have beaten, Pecatonica Argyle, which is a lower Six Rivers team, and then as mentioned, squeaked out a win over Belleville, which is a SWAL team. So they're 2-0. Their schedule hasn't been the strongest, but Lancaster is licking its wounds, obviously, after really getting uncharacteristically manhandled by Cuba City. So that game Friday night, it kind of will separate contender from pretender, I think.
I agree with you there. Yep. Go ahead, Wally.
Yeah, and I was going to say the same thing. I think you're looking right now as a fact that, New Glarus can say, whoopee, look at us. We've got the best record. Yeah, that's not going to last long, I don't think. I really don't. And when you mentioned about that close game with Belleville, I'm sorry, I don't think they're not who they were a couple of years ago. They're not at that quality level. They're a good team, and you have to be careful of them. but they're not what they were a couple of years ago by any means at all. And, we're talking about a lot of SWC teams here, but I've got something else I'll throw about SWC when we're ready.
Yeah, I guess the other thing, going back to Lancaster for just a second, is, like Matthew mentioned, Samaji Benson, very good, track athlete. And, when he has the ball in his hands, he's dangerous. I mean, he's scored, 250+ yard touchdowns, one in each, game so far this season. They do like lining up in the backfield in the slot. And part of that was probably because of the Gildersleeve injury, where Gildersleeve was kind of lining up in different spots there too. So I do think, obviously the line is probably the biggest issue. I don't think it's necessarily the running backs themselves that are the problem, but yeah, there's obviously some things, up front that has to happen. And I do think Lancaster cleaned up their penalties from week 1 too, because it wasn't just Mineral Point that was drawing the Pinks penalties in those games. It was Lancaster too. And when you're going with 1st and 15 instead of 1st and 10, or you have a big play call back, I think stuff like that sometimes that just kind of snowballs. And it just kind of felt like for Lancaster, the 2 early interceptions just really kind of snowballed, and all the momentum just kind of drained for him. So I'm very interested to see how Lancaster bounces back. Again, Lancaster hosts New Glarus on Extreme 107.1 and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. Rob and Wally will have the call of that one. We'll also have Broadhead Judah at Platteville on ESPN Radio AM 1590 WPVL. Steve, you were talking about your pregame chat with Coach Arneson. Looking at Broadhead Judah, they are, 0-2. Again, that's one of those teams that have been very good in recent years, but starting off 0-2 under a new head coach over there. What's the outlook for Platteville and the things that they're looking to do in this week 3 matchup with the Cardinals?
Well, again, it comes, as far as their offense goes, it comes down to executing better. They have been able, in both games, they were able to move the ball between the 20s, but when they got close to or in the Vitek green zone, that's when things started to fall apart. And particularly in a drive that Platteville had right before the half, they had the ball 1st and goal at the 1 yard line. But then this is what happened. They got a 5-yard penalty, got pushed back to the 6. They needed 2 plays to get to the 1, where it was 3rd and goal, didn't get it. And then 4th and goal from the 1 and didn't get it. And that is a kind of a microcosm of what's gone wrong for Platteville in the last couple of weeks. Broadhead Judah is also 0-2. They have gone up against bigger schools. I'm not sure that I'm not sure where they're going to fit in their conferences, but they played Edgerton in the first week and got beat by 2 scores, and then lost a close one against Evansville last week. So the thing that is interesting about Broadhead Judah is that they have a new coach, Gus Wadig, who replaced Jim Matthias, who was very successful in his 17 years. And the other thing they've done is they have gone to more of a spread look, or at least that's what it appears to be based on the stats over the first couple of weeks, until they get into the Vitek green zone, and then they're kind of more of a power eye look. So, and I'm sure Wally will think, why did you abandon the wing T? But there's new coach, new thoughts, and all that sort of thing. There is kind of a side note to this that's kind of a fun thing. Gus Wadig played football for Minnesota Duluth. Before that, he played football for Walworth Bigfoot. Wally and I called his last high school game. It was in 2013. It was in level 3. Walworth Bigfoot was undefeated, #1 ranked, playing Platteville, which just squeaked into the playoffs, got a road win over Broadhead Judah the week before. And what was the final score of that game, Wally?
That was the Hurricane game.
Yes.
The wind was unbelievable. And like I said, I've seen a lot of high school football over the years. I don't ever remember seeing that much wind in a game. I mean, how often can you punt the ball and the ball goes backwards?
Yeah. Platteville ended up winning the game 7-2. Obviously, they were able to move the ball on the ground better than Bigfoot was. The two, I'm not sure how many people have seen this before. Platteville had fourth and a long way down around their 5-yard line. And so they had to punt. And it's like in the last minute or so, or a couple of minutes of the game. Looks like disaster. And then what looked like disaster because the punt snap hit the goal post and it ended up being a safety. And bizarrely, that benefited Platteville because they have to free kick after a safety, but they kicked from the 20-yard line instead of in the back of their end zone. They were able to push Broadhead Judah back and they were able to play defense. And after the ball game, I asked what is, I'm pretty sure, the stupidest question I've ever asked a coach in 35 years of doing this when I asked Scott Stotts after the game, did you do that deliberately? Of course, he denied he did. And it'd be kind of silly to do that. But the safety really bizarrely worked out a whole lot better than, trying to punt it into the wind and you end up, giving your opponent the ball at your own 30-yard line or something like that. But it was a huge upset. Platteville was able to use the momentum from that to go to state for a team that started off 1-3 and just barely squeaked into the playoffs and all of a sudden went on a big-time roll until they got to Madison.
And ran into another team that shouldn't have been there. Winnicott.
Yes, the Cinderella Bowl, Winnicott. Yeah, that's right. But it's the worst combined record of two teams that stayed in the history of the state football finals. Literally, because Platteville was 5-4 and Winnicott was 4-5 in the regular season, and then they were playing for the state title. So it was one weird night, that's for sure.
So it's basically Iowa playing Iowa in the Orange Bowl during a hurricane. Is
pretty much
pretty. Right. And then the final game in the SWC, Richland Center at Prairie du Chien. Just real quick, Steve, then Wally, is Prairie du Chien now the team to beat in the SWC, or do we think that Platteville and or Lancaster will have a say based on how they played in weeks 1 through 2?
Well, Prairie du Chien, they're 1-1. They're part of 97% of teams are 1-1 right now, it looks like. But keep in mind, their first loss was to La Crosse Aquinas.
Yeah.
And then they, really manhandled Darlington. On the other hand, keep in mind that Prairie du Chien got off to a very good start last year. And then in back-to-back weeks, they lost to Lancaster and Platteville. And all of a sudden, their season kind of briefly went off the rails there. So I guess we'll see. I'm positive they're not going to get a big test coming up against Richland Center, but the next week they come to Platteville. So that'll be a much, much better test, obviously, for the Blackhawks. I'm positive they won't have too much trouble. But, on the other hand, if Richland Center pulls off the upset, then we'll know what kind of year this really is.
See, I look at Prairie du Chien as being a real good football team. I think they're real good. You're looking at Aquinas. Yeah, they lost to Aquinas, but Aquinas is one of the best teams in the division in the state. And they're going to be really somebody that's a force back up in their area. So, again, it's going to have to be a case, like you said, where Prairie du Chien falls apart like they did a year ago. Otherwise, they're going to be the mainstay in the SWC.
Yeah, Richland Center at Prairie du Chien. That wraps up the SWC portion of our conversation. Let's go to the Six Rivers, where this conference, again, is shaping out to be very, very interesting. But what's different this year is that the previous 2 or 3 seasons, it would be Potosi, Cassville, River Ridge, and Blackhawk Warren all kind of playing each other towards the end of the season. But coming up on Friday night, we will have River Ridge at Blackhawk Warren at Warren. Potosi Cassville will be at River Ridge. Iowa Grant is at Seneca Wazeeka Steuben, and then Boscobel is at Pecatonica Argyle. We were talking earlier about how Mineral Point's next 2 weeks are really going to shape out the conference. The next 2 weeks for River Ridge is going to factor into how the Six Rivers plays out, because after River Ridge takes on Blackhawk Warren, they then host Potosi Cassville next week. So it's a very big couple weeks for the River Ridge Timberwolves. I'm very high on them just with all the players that they have coming back from last year. And, it just kind of feels like River Ridge has kind of been, they've been competitive against Potosi Cassville and Blackhawk Warren. They did force that three-way tie for the conference in 2021, I believe, is what it was. So they've been able to play those teams kind of tough. They just fall just a bit short to very good, very competitive teams in the Six Rivers. This is a really interesting matchup with Blackhawk Warren because, again, Blackhawk Warren gets upset by Southwestern East Dubuque in week 1 and then plays Bigfoot and then just trounces Bigfoot. I think 52-0 was the final of that one. So River Ridge going to Blackhawk Warren, I think, is a big contest to keep an eye on. And then Potosi Cassville at Riverdale. Again, Riverdale, a newcomer to the Six Rivers Conference. I think Potosi Cassville will be able to handle them pretty well. Seneca Wazeeka Steuben, I think kind of another dark horse team to kind of keep tabs on. We know that Wazeeka Steuben and Seneca have good athletes. How that translates from the other sports to football, kind of interesting to see there. I think that they'll take care of Iowa Grant pretty well. And then basketball at Peck Argyle. If basketball is going to come away with a win, I think that this is one of their weeks to really try and do that, just because of how Peck Argyle hasn't had a lot of success in recent years. Wally, I'll start with you. As far as the games that we have coming up in the Six Rivers this week, what's the storyline that kind of stands out to you the most?
Well, I'm going to jump on one of the things you were saying right at the end there, and we're talking about basketball.
Mm-hmm.
My suggestion is if they're not going to beat the big ones. They're not going to beat Potosi Cassville or Blackhawk Warren or River Ridge. But if you're one of the other teams, I think you better be a little bit careful. They've already scored 24 points. And a year ago, I don't know if they scored 24 points all year. They're a better football team. Not good enough to do damage, but enough they actually might get a win this year. And that's a big deal for them.
Well, to that point, Wally, let's also keep in mind that this is the second year that Mark Shafari's been the head coach at basketball, and he's had a full offseason program, and we've seen the numbers go up for basketball. So we do know that there are more players on the basketball side of it. And then, of course, being able to have an established system in place going into the season, that really factors into it, and probably a big reason why they've had success early on as far as being able to put points on the board.
And the people up there have been putting a little more excitement into it.
Mm-hmm.
That's the big thing, is get the kids excited. But as far as the games that in the Six Rivers this week, River Ridge is going to have their hands full with Blackhawk Warren, because Blackhawk Warren still has stuff to prove after that first week. They really do. And especially playing down at Warren. And I'm not saying River Ridge is not going to win that ball game, but I'll tell you what, I sure wouldn't mind being in each locker room before the game, listening to the pregame talks, because it's going to be something when those kids come out ready to face each other. I think that's going to be maybe the best game to watch in the area. Who's going to win it? I wouldn't even fathom to take a guess on that one. I do lean a little bit towards Ridge. I do, a little. But again, can't make predictions there. As I look at the other games in that conference, Potosi Cassville at Riverdale, ho hum. I'm sorry, Riverdale, that's going to be a long night. Iowa Grant at Wazeeka Seneca. I'm sorry, Iowa Grant. That's you don't have the milk can to lean on or anything like that this year. That's not going to go well for them. And again, they have that basketball Peck Argyle. Hey, if basketball scores 3 touchdowns, they win.
You think about it in the Six Rivers, it's pretty obvious who the best 3 teams are.
Yep.
And Wazeeka Steuben, probably fourth. Although,
Mhm.
keep in mind, Wazeeka Steuben, I think we all missed this, that Wazeeka Steuben Seneca pulled off a huge win in their first game when they beat Cashton. I mean,
Yeah.
Cashton is a perennial going deep in the playoffs.
Yeah.
And I looked at that score and I assumed that it was reported wrong, but so, Wazeeka Steuben Seneca might be better than people thought going into the season. To be generous, let's say there's a top four there in Six Rivers, and there's a bottom four that's pretty obvious in the Six Rivers. But keep in mind that essentially almost all teams with 3 conference wins get into the playoffs. And I wouldn't bet any money that the 5th place team in the Six Rivers would go very far in the playoffs, but I would think it would be a huge accomplishment for whoever can win 3 games, if any of those teams can win 3 games, to get them in the playoffs. I guess the worst thing that could happen is Peck Argyle beats Boscobel, which beats Iowa Grant, which beats Riverdale, and nobody ends up with a 3. But that Boscobel Peck Argyle game actually has more importance than you might think because of that question: can Boscobel or Peck Argyle get to 3 wins? If they're going to get to 3 wins, they got to win that game. Whoever wins that game is a leg up on the top of the bottom half, basically. Obviously, Iowa Grant is not going to be favored. Riverdale is not going to be favored this week. So, as strange as that sounds, that does make the Boscobel Peck Argyle game actually a pretty important game this week.
Yep, and going back to what you were mentioning earlier, Wally, about the River Ridge Blackhawk Warren game, I think this game is going to really determine how great that River Ridge defense is. Because when you look at the scoring, they shut out Benton Scales Mound, Schallsburg in the first game, and then only allowed 8 points against Fenimore last week. If that defense is for real, and they can come away with a win at Warren, not saying that Potosi Castle would be overlooking River Ridge by any stretch, but that shows just how good that this River Ridge team is capable of being. I was talking before we jumped on to record. Elliot Thornton, one of my players of the week, has 5 sacks on the season already through 2 games. He had 2 of them against Fenimore last week, and really that one of the catalysts for this River Ridge defense. I'm very curious to see how that River Ridge defense plays against Blackhawk Warren. And then, again, what happens next week against Potosi Cassville, because this game is going to be physical, probably one of the more physical games that's going to be, in the area. And then having one physical game followed by another physical game against one of your top rivals, that's a very tough test for River Ridge. And if they can withstand that, boy, look out D7, because River Ridge is going to be for real.
That is a gauntlet to go through.
Mm-hmm.
When you line up and you've got Blackhawk Warren and you follow that up with Potosi Cassville, I'll tell you what, you will have earned your stripes if you come out of that with 2 wins. You will have really earned it. And I mean, good luck, River Ridge. You're going to need all the luck you can get to get through both of them.
Hopefully both teams can leave the game healthy, just knowing how physical both teams, love to play. So that's the recap and preview of the 6 Rivers. And let's wrap things up with 8-player football, because 8-player football kicked off last week, and the 2 teams that we have our eye on in the area had outstanding performances in their first games. Highland defeating Williams Bay in their 8-player football debut 49-8, and then Belmont defeated St. John's 46-8. Other teams in the Ridge and Valley 8-player that got wins: North Crawford defeated Montello 56-20, and who else?
Minnesota over Princeton Green Lake 50-0.
Yep. So those are the teams that got wins. And then coming up on Friday night on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel, I'll be calling the game with Gary Craw. Highland making their home debut as an 8-player football program, welcoming Belmont, who, as we know, Belmont has had a lot of success since switching to 8-player football. I'm very excited to see what that environment's going to be like at Tyler Field, and the first football matchup for Highland and Belmont, I believe, since 2017. I think that was the year before that Belmont switched to 8-player. Steve, I'll start with you, and then Rob, if you want to chime in for Belmont as well. We know how awesome it is to call games at Highland, and we were talking in the preview show about what firepower Highland brings back after winning the Ridge and Valley 11-player conference last year. That they got to retire and they have that trophy case or trophy in their trophy case, that they can brag about. But they have some firepower. They come in now as the number 10 ranked team in 8-player football in the latest SwissSports.net coaches poll. And Highland to me seems very dangerous and can be a team that can make some noise in 8-player football this year.
Oh, absolutely. And I felt that from the start. And, when you look at the Cardinal, when you bring back your quarterback and 3 receivers back from a team that won their conference, and yes, the Ridge and Valley was unique last year, but, conference champ is a conference champ. And I thought immediately that Highland had a shot at doing very well. And, one game is obviously a small sample size, but I absolutely believe that this game is going to be, quite a test for both schools, actually, because Belmont has several people to replace from their team last year. But on the other hand, they immediately took to 8-player football. And I think that they may have prompted a few schools to switch to 8-player just because of the immediate success that they had. Now you look at, we have obviously Highland is an 8-player school, and Monticello is an 8-player school, and other teams, other schools have joined or made the switch in the case of Wanawak Center Weston. So this is going to be a really fun game to watch Friday night, just to see a more established 8-player program against the new guys who at least got off to a flying start.
Yep, and Rob, for Belmont, we made a state appearance in 2022, fell to Wausau Newman, and then in 2020, even though it wasn't technically a state championship, they were undefeated and played what was considered the state championship game there. Love what Brandon Weiss has been doing with the program there, and after just missing the playoffs last year, Belmont seems to be getting things on the right track, and should be a fun season for the Belmont 8-player football team as well.
Yeah, a couple thoughts on Belmont and also 8-player in general. So first of all, as Steve pointed out, once Belmont kind of jumped into the 8-player swimming pool, if you will, and had that big cannonball and the big splash, and everybody saw, wow, look at that. Belmont's, they're doing pretty good. The community, the school, they've embraced it. They, they kept their football program. They kept their hometown pride. And so you're right. And then Steve alluded to that there's other schools, other small schools that are watching, and they're going, well, maybe we can do this. Highland is the next one to jump into the pool. And maybe there's a few other schools that are going to jump into the pool. And the thought I had was, for Belmont, as you said, they've had success and they've enjoyed their time dropping down to 8-player, even though there was unknown initially, right? But the thing about it is, if you get more local, teams from Southwest Wisconsin to jump into that pool, all of a sudden, you've got, some of these rivalries, some of these small town rivalries back, and you can form, a more localized conference too, because that's the one, downside, especially when Belmont initially joined, is the travel. I mean, you're going a long ways oftentimes to play these 8-player games because there just weren't many 8-player teams in the area, and now, they're starting to be more. And again, teams see the success that they have. Now, getting back to Belmont specifically, they've just like every other small school, it ebbs and flows between class sizes and what kind of athletes you have. They do have some good upcoming athletes in the I would say from the sophomore, junior up to senior ranks this year. And the advantage of playing 8-player, of course, and this is like, well, duh, is you need fewer players. So you don't have to have, like with a 5-man offensive line, for instance. Boy, that's a lot of holes to fill. You got, try to find 5 really good blockers in a small town. But if you only have like 3, guess what? You can find, a couple big hosses to get in there and do some blocking. And that's the one thing. Highland also, I think, is going to find this as well. You just need fewer. You still need good athletes, but you just need fewer of them, and you can have success. And that is the attractiveness of it. And Belmont has found that out, and Highland is about to find that out. And, again, some of these other small towns in Southwest Wisconsin, I think they will be, if they jump into the pool, they will like the water. They'll go, this is kind of nice. So,
and a couple other comments about 8-player football. Brad Richardson and I were able to be up at that mythical state championship in Boston when Belmont played Gilman. And Gilman was they were destroying everyone. That was a case where you found that all of a sudden Belmont had the one player that could beat Gilman. And all of a sudden it was a disaster for Gilman because, and it's bothering me. He's going to be a defensive end for UW Platteville this year. It's bothering me. I can't think of his name right now.
Riley Christensen.
Pardon?
Riley Christensen.
Yes, Riley Christensen. Riley Christensen took the Belmont team, put him on his back, and drove the entire field to win the game with then a pass interception in the last second that was also taken care of by Belmont to win it. But you can do that in 8-player. You don't find that happening in 11-man quite the same, not at that top echelon level. Lower teams, yes, but not at that top echelon. And again, my congratulations to Belmont still going back to that game because it was so awesome.
Well, I'm not arguing with Wally here, but I will say that a 250-pound quarterback, which Riley Christensen was, is difficult to tackle. A 230-pound quarterback, which Reed Ackerman from Mineral Point is also difficult to tackle. And I actually think it actually kind of proves a point that Rob made, which is that you don't need as many athletes. So if you have somebody who's kind of I don't want to call Riley a freak, but how many 250-pound quarterbacks are there anywhere? So if you've got a guy who is an athlete far exceeding what you expect from a really small school, he's just going to dominate everybody. And that is certainly what Riley Christensen did. And that is what, having great athletes, when you're only got 8 guys on the field, that's what that can really do for you.
Yeah, 8-player football, it's a fun brand of football. If you've never watched it, watch what we've got for you on Friday night on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. Belmont at Highland in 8-player football on Friday night.
And Rob, enjoy the steak sandwiches at Highlands.
Oh,
yes.
That's one of the things we could get back to. We go back many, many years ago when Kyle Cooper was back around in our area. We ranked all the concession stands. And I think it's time we try to slip a little bit of that in here. And I already have my vote as to one of the best. But let's just see how these others can match up. And that is good at Highland. I will again say that. You can go there and have supper.
I think what we need to do is, we'll get to Steve's high five in just a bit here, but if we can get Wally's high five ranking the concession stands in all of Southwest Wisconsin, I think that's something that will be valuable for all of our listeners and watchers. So yeah, we'll touch on that on a later episode. But let's talk about our teams of the week. Again, we didn't have an episode after week 1, so we'll kind of combine weeks 1 and 2 here. The teams of the week for me, in week 1, Southwestern East Dubuque defeating Blackhawk Warren. That upset win, just in terms of rankings, I thought was there. But, Southwestern East Dubuque has been an upward trending team, and I think that's a signature win under Coach Felder at Southwestern East Dubuque for the Warcats. And then week 2, like I mentioned earlier, Cuba City. I mean, you can't argue with how impressive, that team was last week, the way the defense played, the way the running game was going. Just a clinic type performance for Cuba City in weeks 1 and 2. We'll start off with you, Steve. Any other teams from weeks 1 and 2 that stood out to you?
Well, I think one in week 1 was, and again, we didn't get to mention it, but Wazeeka Steuben Seneca. I don't know if Cashton is as good a team as they've been in the past, but they've been really, really good for a number of years, as the teams they have beaten in the playoffs have demonstrated. So for Wazeeka Steuben Seneca to beat as established a program as Cashton is, was one of those, as I said, it was one of those games where you look at, it's like, that really happened? What happened? And then I would agree with you last week about Cuba City, just taking what we think is a good team in Lancaster and just steamrolling them, and recovering very well from a disappointing loss to Potosi Castle in the first week.
Yeah, Wally, your teams of the week.
I start right off at week 1 because I looked at the fact that the Cuba City Potosi Cashville game that first week was going to be the game of the week to be right away. And it turns out it was. I cannot believe how Potosi Castle basically handled Cuba City, but it was mostly due to a defensive line and some pretty good offensive line play as well. It was the guys up front there, because I know, Rob, we had trouble looking at who do we name as the players of the game here, because, you could pick him and him and him and him, and because it was such a strong team effort. And that's a biggie. It comes to week 2, I have to concur. Cuba City coming back like that and throttling Lancaster. That's something, again, that I didn't see coming. I didn't see that happening at all.
Yeah, I have to admit, when I was calling the game with Gary Craw, we could not verbally articulate what it was that we were seeing. We had a hard time comprehending what exactly was happening in that game. Rob and then Matthew, your teams of the week, if there are any that haven't been mentioned.
Yeah, I mean, for me, Potosi Cassville week 1, Wally obviously touched on that. And again, Cuba City. I mean, hate to beat the dead horse here. Let's throw a little love though to Prairie du Chien, which obviously, holy cow, what they did to Darlington again, kind of jaw dropping. So I didn't listen to that game and didn't get a chance to see that game, but just again seeing the score and seeing the domination, obviously. That's impressive too. So that's what I would go with.
And for me, for week 1, I'm going to go with Southwestern East Dubuque. They got the big win over Blackhawk Warren, and that potentially going to catapult them into a successful SWAL season where they could potentially compete with some teams and look to get a playoff spot. And then in week 2, obviously Cuba City, incredible performance all around. I'm also going to go with Prairie du Chien, like Rob said, because if you look at their schedule, it's pretty favorable. They play 2 of the better teams in the league, at least based on how they've looked so far and where they stack up against some other schools in New Glarus and Lancaster week 8 and week 9. Besides that, they've got Platteville in there, but you can kind of argue the SWC is kind of wide open at the top. So as long as Prairie du Chien can keep it up, stay together, keep their momentum, stay healthy, they've got a pretty good shot to win the conference, especially based on how they looked in week 2.
There is one other team that I will mention. They are not in any of the conferences that we cover, but they are an alum of the SWAL. And thank you to Steve for bringing this to my attention. Parkview Albany ends a losing streak by defeating Whitefish Bay Dominican 55-24 last Friday. So congratulations to Parkview Albany on getting the win, because as if the season can't be weird enough, that's the thing that's one of the other things that stands out. Yeah.
That's frosting.
Yeah.
But if we want, excuse me, I got to put my last little plug in for the week. Saturday night, 6 o'clock. UW Platteville opens the season at home against Lakeland University. And we mentioned Riley Christensen. He's moving from linebacker to D-end, and he is going to be a good one there. But come and enjoy that Saturday night.
It should be a fun season for the Pioneers, and I'm sure you will be our Pioneers truther throughout the season as well, Wally. Players of the week. Yeah, players of the week real quick. I'll name off the two that I have. For me, it's for both weeks 1 and 2, Gavin Vossen, the first game against Potosi Cassville, 9 catches, over 100 yards, and a touchdown. And then in the game against Lancaster, had 2 interceptions and then had a 83-yard touchdown reception to help Cuba City in that big win against Lancaster. And then, like I mentioned earlier, River Ridge, Elliott Thornton, 5 sacks on the season already through 2 games. Outstanding, stat line, and again, a big reason why River Ridge has had success on the defensive side of the ball so far this season. Same order that we had for teams of the week. Steve, any other players that you'd like to recognize through 2 weeks of the season?
I would combine on offense maybe the first and second weeks. Dawson Weber from Potosi Cassville. New quarterback. Boy, it sure is fun to have a great offensive line in front of you when you're a new quarterback. But he's played very well in the first 2 weeks, and obviously against a good team in Cuba City. And then he threw for, I believe, 209 against Richland Center. And yeah, Richland Center is not a very good program at this point, but they're a bigger school. So I thought that was a great accomplishment for a brand new quarterback in Dawson Weber on offense. Then on defense, I think what comes to mind is Jason Phillips from Mineral Point. He is, for one thing, probably going to be playing on Saturdays next year. And he was part of a very good offensive line performance and even better defensive line performance for Mineral Point. And his coach, Justin Leonard, actually said that if he had more availability to do this, he felt that Jacob Phillips, that Jacob could be a great tight end, but he's needed on the offensive line. He plays left tackle, and he is the best middle linebacker in the area. So Jacob Phillips is my defensive pick for player of the week.
I concur on defense right away. I mean, if you're 6'4", 230 pounds, and you're standing at the inside linebacker spot, first of all, you're going to see what's going on. And when you have the ability to chase it down and to close it up, and he does, you just can't take something away from that. That is phenomenal in that position. And you mentioned, with the quarterback for Potosi Castle, wherever, he's something else too. Where he came out of nowhere. Kind of reminds me of where TJ Pink was a year ago. TJ Pink came out of the woodwork, and all of a sudden he's just lighting it up. We could see that same thing coming out of Potosi Cassville with him.
Agreed. Rob, your players.
Yeah, I'm going to go with Cuba City's running back, Andy Leffelholtz, last week. Over 150 yards rushing, 3 touchdowns. I mean, wow. You talk again against Lancaster, not to pile on the arrows, but holy cow, what a performance. And, as far as defense goes, Wally heard me mention this a few times in our week 1 game. But there's a defender for Potosi Cassville who's one of their linebackers, outside linebacker, who's also a hockey player, and I happen to have
that was going to come up.
Yeah, well, I happen to have a soft spot for hockey players who are not soft at all, if you know the game of hockey. And Nolan Pierce from Potosi Cassville, boy, did he lay the wood. He had some big hits, some big TFLs, and the standout play, Wally, if you remember, was that special teams tackle where he blew up the return man for Cuba City and pin them deep inside their 15-yard line on a special teams tackle. You always love guys who play full-time D and then also splash on special teams, and Nolan Pierce did that. And yes, he's a hockey player. So,
well, he did check him into the boards pretty hard.
Exactly.
All right, Matthew, your players of the week.
Well, I hate to sound like a broken record, but offensively, I'm going to go with Andy Leffelholtz. One of the most impressive things to me, besides his 3 touchdowns that he had in that week 2 performance, is that he averaged 9.3 yards per rush. So very strong runner, picks up a lot of yards after contact, and he's going to be a big piece for Cuba City this year. And then defensively, I'll give the nod to Jacob Phillips, a really strong linebacker, sees the field really well, and as a lot of the other guys mentioned, he gets off some of the blocks really well. He's picked up a sack on the year already, so it's going to be a big piece for Mineral Point in the next couple of weeks.
All right, those are our players of the week. And before we wrap up, we have to get to Steve's High Five, where Steve Prestegard kindly ranks our area teams 1 through 5, and then we mercilessly tell him why he's wrong. So, Steve, I know that we were texting back and forth about what your high five looked like from the preseason through week 1 to week 2. This whole season's just kind of been a mess. Let's see how you've tried to make sense of our area football teams.
Well, actually the first 3 spots were pretty straightforward. It's after that you're like, I don't know, should there? Well, maybe not, or whatever. But what I finally came up with, because again, there's like 97% of the teams in the area have 1 win and 1 loss. But what I have figured out is I have Cuba City ranked 5th and Prairie du Chien ranked 4th. Those are the 2 1-1 teams. And basically it's about how Cuba City just hammered Lancaster and how Prairie du Chien just hammered Darlington, both after losses to open up the season. So then we get to the teams that are undefeated at this point, and my 3rd place team is Southwestern East Dubuque. I think everybody was just flabbergasted that they were able to beat Blackhawk Warren in the first week. And then number 2 is River Ridge. They have looked very, very good in the first 2 weeks. I don't know that they play the caliber of teams, perhaps, that other schools have. But if your schedule is that way, you got to make sure you play really well. And they have played really well in the first 2 weeks of the season. And then number 1 seems pretty obvious at this point is Potosi Cassville. Because, again, they have played really well, and they beat a great team, or what we think is a great team, Cuba City in the first week, and then just throttled Richland Center in the week after that. That's my top 5. It is different looking from the previous week, and I won't even start to talk about what my preseason top 5 looked like, because then and now, not quite the same.
Yeah, the only thing I find fascinating about it is that neither of the teams that went to state last year are in the high 5 through 2 weeks of the season, just because of how strange this season has played out. And I think that just speaks to, the depth and, how many great teams there are in Southwest Wisconsin. You have a number of teams, divisions, 4 through 7 that are capable of having deep postseason runs. I think it's just very interesting. Again, Potosi, Cassville, and River Ridge, they have a head-to-head matchup next week, and how that kind of shakes things out. But guys, any thoughts or any other input on Steve's high 5, and is he on right track, and are we gonna spare him from being sauteed on this episode?
Well, I would say he got 1 right. So, applause for, the top ranked team, because I would agree with Potosi Cassville, but I'm sorry, I am not willing to say Darlington is not a top 5 team after 1 loss. And yes, I give Prairie credit for doing what they did, which is why I'd put Prairie at 2nd, even though they're 1-1. I think Potosi Cassville 1, Prairie 2nd, and then maybe River Ridge 3rd, Southwestern East Dubuque 4th, and then Darlington. You got to have Darlington in there. I'm sorry. So I beg to differ. You got to have Darlington in there.
So now we have 2 high 5s. Interesting.
I'm not so certain I completely agree with your last 2. I would reverse them. I would put Darlington ahead of Southwestern East Dubuque.
Oh,
And
a little too much early credit for Southwestern East Dubuque. Is that what I'm sensing, Wally? Okay.
I'm happy for them and all of that because they haven't been there, but you know what? They're still not quite there yet.
Okay.
I would
Give
argue,
enough love to get on the 5.
I would argue it's kind of hard to leave Cuba City out of there after the first 2 weeks too. Can't forget about them.
True.
Yeah.
True.
Well, certainly, as I said, 4 and 5 were difficult to pick because you could go about 6 deep in 4th or 5th as far as there's a lot of 1-1 teams as we pointed out.
Well, at least you got one right, Steve. So,
well, it's mighty generous of you, Rob.
Hey, he said to tear it apart, so I'm tearing.
Yeah, well, nothing's new there.
But I think to give Steve a little bit of credit, that's difficult, I know, but I'll give him some. we turn around and we take a look at Southwest Wisconsin. And we've been fortunate enough to see games from different teams all around the state. Year in and year out. The better teams in the divisions that they're in tend to show up in Southwest Wisconsin. Year in and year out. I think as far as leagues, top to bottom, they're the most physical. I think they provide probably some of the best coaching that we've seen. There's other teams that have good coaches, but we're talking top to bottom in the leagues. It's tough to beat the football in this area, which makes it tough to honestly lay out a high 5 this early in the year.
Yeah.
There, Steve, that's as much credit as I can give you.
Well, gee. I would point out, and I think it's an important thing for people who are not happy with their team's records. Let's remember last year. Darlington got to state with 1 loss, and Blackhawk Warren got to state with 1 loss, and Lancaster got to level 4, or they got to level 3 with 1 loss, and I'm trying to think. Oh, Potosi Cassville ended up getting to level 3 with 1 loss. So it may just be the way things work out this year that the teams because the fact that you're undefeated going in doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to end up going to state. There's a lot of cases over the years of teams that walked into the level of the postseason undefeated and walked out done for the season. So, I really think that if you look at who's been playing whom, that coaches have kind of figured that out, that they need to make sure that their team's ready for the conference season, because if you want a home game, and everybody does, you got to make sure that you're really rolling for the conference season, and comparatively the non-conference season does not, make as much difference perhaps. So I don't think if you're a Darlington fan or a Blackhawk Warren fan, you need to panic, put it that way.
No. One of the other things I would throw along with that is there's different philosophies as far as scheduling for non-conference before a conference. Some of the philosophy out there is you want to have teams that you can be competitive with, but you're going to beat. That's how you want to open, because you want to build the winning thought into your team. There is that school of thought out there with a lot of coaches when it comes to scheduling. They want a tough game, but they don't want a team that's likely going to beat them. You want to have something you really should probably be winning. The other school of thought is kind of what we're seeing. You play as good as you get, because it'll prepare you for that season.
Yeah, I think the thing that I kind of take away from that is that not all 2-0 records are the same. Not all 1-1 records are the same. It's about, how well you're playing, for that. And even if you, did suffer a loss, early on in the season, like Steve and Wally were mentioning, you can get things right, and you can, maybe use that as a way to, really emphasize and take inventory of, where your skill sets are at and what areas you need to improve on to make sure that you're coming down the home stretch. Matthew, I know that you had one more point that you wanted to mention. Go ahead.
Yeah, kind of my final thought is I think for all coaches, you got to be optimistic at this point, because the conference record's going to matter a lot for playoffs compared to non-conference. And now you at least know what you're working with. But as Wally said, some of these leagues are just so deep that every single week matters. And in the SWAL and the SWAL and Six Rivers, rather, specifically, it's the start of conference play where a lot of those big games are. So I think we could see the trend of expecting the unexpected that we've seen the past couple weeks in the next couple weeks once we get into conference play.
Yeah, this is shaping out to be one of the craziest football seasons that we've seen in recent memory. We thought last year was insane. This year's already on pace to beat that out, and we'll be curious to see what the outcomes of our Week 3 games are and how that shakes out the conference pictures in our area. Again, just to recap what we have coming up on Queen Bee Radio this weekend on Friday night on Extreme 107.1 and the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. We have New Glarus at Lancaster, and we have Broadhead Judah at Platteville on ESPN Radio AM 1590 WPVL. Cuba City is at Belleville on Super Hits 106. And then in 8-player football, we have Belmont at Highland. Again, that's on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel. And then we have a bonus Saturday game with Stockton taking on Benton, Scales Mound, Schallsburg. That'll be on Extreme 107.1 on Saturday.
And we're going to try to bring in Lee Corso and a mascot kid, if that is possible, Saturday morning.
I don't know how many of those we'll find in the Schallsburg area, but if we can find a Lee Corso lookalike that's willing to wear a mascot hat, we will certainly try and do so. That's quality high school football content that everyone is looking to see.
And maybe I can, since Kirk Herbstreit from ESPN brings his golden retriever, maybe I can bring my dog to the game possibly.
Not so fast, my friend.
I think we know some people. We know some people in the greater on the coaching staff of the Benton Scales Mound Schallsburg team. I'm sure that we can get a broadcast support dog with us to make sure that we all get through our broadcast on Saturday safely.
Well, make sure you have one that's vicious to protect yourselves.
Yeah.
All right. Well, this was a really fun, we'll say, hour and a half that we got to chat about high school football. Thanks to Matthew, Rob, Wally, and Steve for joining me for this week's Papa Murphy's of Platteville and Prairie du Chien High School Football Roundup. We'll have another episode next Thursday right here on the Queen Bee Radio Sports YouTube channel.